Do other New Testament writers provide confirming or conflicting evidence to that of the evangelists?
I think that the writings of the evangelists are confirmed by what we have in what is sometimes called the fifth gospel, namely the writings of the Apostle Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus, who was involved in the persecution of the early church, and in an incredible turnaround, he became a Christian because he claimed to have seen an appearance of the risen Jesus. And this turned this man's life upside down. From a Pharisee and persecutor of the early church, he became an ardent Christian missionary who entered into a life of incredible hardship, suffering, and labor, and ultimately made the final sacrifice when he was martyred for his faith in Rome. And Paul hands down to us certain crucial pieces of information, very early traditions about the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, some of the earliest material concerning the resurrection is delivered by Paul in the first letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth, in the 15th chapter of his letter to the Corinthians. He cites there a tradition which he says he himself received and then handed on to the Corinthian church. And the words here are the technical rabbinical terms for the transmission of Jewish tradition. And the saying that follows this introduction is then a very stylized and non-Pauline tradition in which Paul says Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, he was buried, he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And then after that, Paul goes on to continue piling up other eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, including an appearance to some 500 people, most of whom Paul says are still alive at the time of his writing, around AD 55, though he says some have died. Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are still alive. They're still there to be questioned, even though Paul knew that some had passed away in the meantime. So this information that Paul gives us about the resurrection appearances, I think, is very important because it refers to some of the same appearances that we have mentioned in the Gospels, particularly the appearance to the 12 disciples, which is also related in Luke and John, and provides an early, incontrovertible attestation to the historicity of those appearances so that these cannot be written off as later legends that the evangelists eventually committed to writing. I also think that Paul's information furnishes good grounds for belief in the empty tomb as well. Paul's letters are what might be called accidental letters, in the sense that he's not writing systematic theological treatises, nor is he writing a history or a life of Jesus. They're not gospels. The letters are accidental in the sense that they respond to various particular situations and questions and problems in the churches that he pastored. And so he doesn't have occasion to specifically mention the empty tomb as such, but I think that Paul implies the empty tomb in a couple of the things that he says. In this tradition that he cites in 1 Corinthians 15, the phrase, "he was buried," followed by the phrase, "and he was raised," implies an empty grave. No first century Jew, and particularly Pharisee, could have thought otherwise. The idea that a man was buried and then raised by God from the dead, but that his corpse still lay in the tomb, would have been an impossible contradiction for a first century Jew. For a first century Jew, there was simply no difference in meaning between a resurrection and a physical grave emptying resurrection. So that in citing these chronological events, he was executed, he was crucified, he was buried, he was raised, he appeared, Paul in effect implies an empty tomb. This is confirmed, I think, when you compare the 4 lines of this tradition to the preaching in the book of Acts, the early apostolic sermons, and when you compare it to the narratives in the Gospels. What you find is that this 4-line tradition handed on by Paul is in effect an outline of the early apostolic preaching. And when you compare it to the preaching in the book of Acts, these early apostolic sermons, the first line corresponds to the event of the crucifixion. The second line, "he was buried," corresponds to Jesus' being laid in the tomb. The third line, "and he was raised," corresponds to the empty tomb narrative. So that I think that this is a summary of the story of the empty tomb. And Paul knew the traditions surrounding the material that he delivered. We know this, for example, from the information he gives about the Lord's Supper, where he speaks of how he passed on to the Corinthians what he received about the Lord on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, etc. And in that story, Paul mentions that this was the night Jesus was betrayed. Well, now the betrayal story is not part of the Last Supper story. That is part of its context. In mentioning the betrayal, Paul shows us that he knows not just the isolated event, but he knows the context of the traditions that he delivered. And therefore, in relating this tradition about the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, I think it's quite certain that Paul knew the context of this and knew the empty tomb story. Now, a second indication that Paul gives, I think, of the empty tomb is the dating of the empty tomb on the third day, or rather of the resurrection on the third day, when he says that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Where do we get this phrase, on the third day? Well, I think the most likely explanation is that this is a time indicator for the discovery of the empty tomb by the women who came on early Sunday morning, which after Jewish reckoning was on the third day after the crucifixion, so that the resurrection naturally came to be dated on the third day, because this was the day that the empty tomb was discovered by the women followers of Jesus. So I think that implicit in the information delivered by Paul is the fact of the empty tomb, as well as his explicit mention of the resurrection appearances. And Paul's information, I think, would be the most important material in the New Testament outside the Gospels that goes to confirm what the Gospels say.